I'm just going to give it another minute before we start. I'm always acutely conscious of the time that you're all giving up for this session. And that's why we even originally said 45 minutes, because I think, you know, online fatigue is definitely hitting everybody. So I think I'm going to get started. I think we've still got a few more people to join us, but I am conscious of time. So thank you all for joining us for another of our round tables. I think there's a couple of people who are new to these events, so I'd like to say welcome, and to also give you just a little bit of context. So whilst I've been doing my work running HappyMaven, we're championing and implementing wellbeing at work across different organisations. We found that we became just more and more aware that HR leaders, you all hold the space for pretty much everyone else. You hold the space for your people, your peers, the rest of the leadership team, and of course your commitments at home. And yet often, as the conversation with Darren shows, that you yourselves are left with little or no support whilst you're juggling all of this and you're giving of yourselves. So these events were originally convened in person, obviously, to give you all a safe and confidential space to share, discuss and learn about well-being and inclusion, and also talk about the challenges you as leaders face and perhaps even as individuals. So today's session is perhaps a little different from previous events. And I say that because it was conceived in frustration. It was conceived in a little bit of upset, and if I'm honest, it was conceived in anger. And I wanted to take that anger and that frustration as an opportunity to start some candid and brave conversations about the incontrovertible links between lack of opportunity, racism, sexism, lip service inclusion, and the impact upon mental health. And as over the last 6 months we've seen with coronavirus, the impact upon physical health. And I think that all of us, all of the leaders, the decision makers on this call, we do each other and the wider world a disservice if we candy coat our current lived reality. So I'm honoured to be joined by 3 panellists who are not only experts in their fields, but they have no problem in speaking truth to power. So the format of the next 45 minutes, and with your permission, the panelists have also agreed that if there is the interest, they can run till 10:30, so they can run to the hour. So the format will be that I will ask them each to introduce themselves and their work. We will then go into a panel format for questions. And during that time, I would ask if any of the non-panelists could please mute their microphones and turn their cameras off, so the focus is on Caroline, Heeral and Nancy. But in the meantime, please do use the chat function to ask any questions that are pressing for yourself. After the panel element, I will either ask the questions that you've asked from the chat, or please feel free to unmute yourself, put your camera on and ask the questions yourselves. So the panelists are 3 of the most inspiring women that I know. Since I launched HappyMaven, they've been generous with their time, they've been generous with their expertise, and they've actually been very humble about their individual contributions in their respective fields. However, over the past year, not just the past 6 months, over the past year or so, I've also seen their growing frustrations at the slow pace of change. The slow pace of change about centering inclusion, about recognizing the contribution of diversity, and of course, the importance of our well-being. So I'd like to introduce you all to Heeral Gudka, the founder of Convergent Consulting, Caroline Ribeiro-Nelson, head of Free Choices, and Dr. Nancy Roberts, founder and CEO at Umbrella Analytics. Heeral, over to you.
Thank you so much, Suki. It's an honor to be invited to be on this panel. Thank you so much for the invitation. I founded Convergent Consulting probably about 5-6 years ago. I started working as a consultant 5-6 years ago as a leadership inclusion well-being consultant, born from anger, actually, similarly to Suki, but the anger is older, maybe, I guess, or it's been longer running because of the slow pace of change, because of the clumsy conversations held within the corporate world where I lived for 15 years prior to setting up my business. And my philosophy, the philosophy of my work, is that for people to thrive in the workplace, you need leaders who know how to lead, who understand the importance of creating inclusive work environments, and also understand that the link between inclusion and well-being. So those are the three fundamental elements of my work: leadership, inclusion, and well-being, because they are completely linked. So again, thank you so much for inviting me today.
Thank you, Heeral. Thank you. See, I couldn't have done justice to that. Caroline, over to you, please.
Thank you, Suki. It's a pleasure being here. I trained as a psychotherapist and coach 25 years ago. So I've been in the mental health and wellbeing space for quite a long time. And my focus has really been working with organizations, individuals, and businesses to develop their mental health and wellbeing strategy. So, and that's about really transforming company culture. So it's not about, you know, the fruit on the table and the massage or the 1 week kind of health and well-being sessions. It's really about helping companies think about what is going on within their culture. How can they develop a safe space for their employees and support their mental health and well-being connected with diversity? What I've been noticing, as Suki said earlier, is that diversity and inclusion seems to be very separate and sidelined within organizations and not a very strong part of the agenda. What I've been recognizing in the work that I do as a psychotherapist and working with companies is that diversity and inclusion is strongly linked to mental health and well-being. So I look at what is it about somebody's diverse background, and also for women, that affects and impacts their way of interacting, coping with their life challenges, and looking at in the workplace, how can HR leaders take on that responsibility in a way that they feel that they are skilled and competent and aware enough to develop that within their culture. So that's me.
Thank you so much, Caroline, and thank you for creating those, well, not creating, talking about those links between all of those intersections and mental health. Very much appreciated. Nancy, thank you. Over to you.
Morning, everyone. Delighted to be here, and just echoing the sentiments of Heeral and Caroline that this is a great conversation to be part of, and really pleased to see so many people engaged on the call this morning. And again, thank you to Suki for convening this. So my business is called Umbrella, and we're really focused on evidence-based action around diversity and inclusion. So we look at what does the research tell us is actually going to make a difference. So we look at things like pay and promotion strategies, we look at people analytics, lots of the kind of nuts and bolts of how inequality in companies can manifest itself. And then on the other side, my background is very much around language and how language shapes culture. So we also have tools which enable companies to assess how inclusive their language is. And that feeds in from Caroline's point around, this is around cultural change. And you can't have an organization doing diversity in a corner. So you need to think about how that flows through the way you talk about the organization, the way you talk about your employees, what kind of values and sort of mission statements you put out there and how they might impact people. So we help companies to think through the kind of unseen effects of the language that they use and make sure that they're being as inclusive as possible. So we're very much focused around the technology and how the technology can help us do this at scale. So that's my passion.
Thank you, Nancy. Thank you, all three of you. So I've prepared some questions. These are the questions that are either burning top of mind for me, or they're the questions that I wish that leadership teams and boards would ask. But I'm going to ask all of the rest of the attendees, please do use the chat function for your questions, and I will keep referring back to have a look at those. And like I say, once I've finished, you can please turn your video and your microphone back on. So my first question, and I'm going to ask this to Caroline, this is something that's very much top of mind for me at the moment. Caroline, can you speak a little bit more to the mental health impact of not just COVID, but also of Black Lives Matter?
Great. Suki, thanks for starting off with a really easy question there. I really think that when we're looking at what's happening in terms of the Black Lives Matter and COVID-19, I see a really clear connection in the fact that both of those things involve traumatic experiences. And when I talk about traumatic experiences, that's very much about things that present a threat to our life and physical and mental well-being. So we're seeing now where with COVID, people are really reacting in a way that is showing traumatic symptoms. So you're seeing fear, anxiety, loss, bereavement, people not sleeping, people becoming suicidal. We have people who have lost their life because of the impact, the economic and physical impact of what's going on. And also when we're looking at the Black Lives Matter, this is something that in itself is a social movement that was formed for peaceful process, social justice. But actually what it's highlighted is what's going on and has been going on for many, many years, is the experience of Black people and the fact that we are faced with racism, violence, abuse and discrimination, harassment. And these are traumatic experiences that affect people as a whole. And this is what is actually what we're seeing playing out now. So we talk about racial trauma, and we also look at that sense of anger, disappointment, that whole sense of being exhausted. And we're seeing then the mental health impact of that on well-being being played out, because we've now got this combination between the COVID and what's going on within people's personal history. And this is something that goes back to the workplace, because then that falls on the HR leaders to look at, how can I understand what's going on now? How can I come together and bring my company and my employees to a point where we're acknowledging what's going on, where we're understanding these traumatic events? What can we do as HR leaders? How can we partner with organizations outside who are specialists within this to guide us? And what is our responsibility here in terms of health and safety, in terms of physical well-being? So how can we protect our employees in terms of the COVID risk and the mental health? What can we be doing to look at how is that impacting the people that we are responsible for? So it's a big challenge, in fact. And I'm not one to spread doom and gloom, but we're talking about the reality of what people are actually facing.
No, thank you, Caroline, and thank you for articulating what is a very, very painful period for many people. And you quite rightly say that we have that onus on HR leaders, leadership generally, to be driving this, which brings me very serendipitously to my next question for Heeral. Heeral, in your experience, what do you find yourself saying to leaders when they say that inclusion is just a fad, it's just political correctness, we'll move on to the next things very soon?
Yes, when I hear that, really when people talk about political correctness and you hear, you know, all the language and inflammatory language being used on social media in particular, but behind that there's real people thinking exactly what you just said, that inclusion is just people being politically correct. When people actually engage in that conversation, what we're saying is that we don't want to listen to truths which are uncomfortable. We just don't want to hear it. It's a tool that's used to stop conversations, and you know, a lot of the time it does work, particularly when used by people with power, so especially leaders. However, what we actually need in any situation is clear, transparent, and respectful conversation. That's what talking about inclusion actually is. It's not political correctness. It's listening to the experiences of people. Some of those people will be just like you, and some of those people will be different to you. And what we need to do is become comfortable with sitting with the fact that some people have faced and continue to face very, very difficult experiences on a day-to-day basis. So specifically at the moment, we're talking about, Caroline was talking about Black Lives Matter and the sheer amount of anti-Black racism that exists in the world, but we're talking, let's just stick with Western society for the time being. It's a difficult conversation to have, which is why people throw the term political correctness. They don't want to think that it's really true, because then we have to self-reflect as to how we may consciously or inadvertently be participating or playing a part in perpetuating negative experiences for people. So I guess my counter to this is to say to leaders, let's stop avoiding conversations. Let's build your resilience and your empathy, and let's start to engage with people whose voices are still not being heard. That's what inclusion is about. It's about listening to people. That's not what diversity is. Diversity is just chucking a whole mix of people into a room, but that doesn't breed inclusion. Inclusion is actually listening to those people and making them feel welcome. I actually wrote about this the other day, where if as an organization you invite someone into your company, you offer them a job and you invite them in to your community, what is the point of doing that if you're going to exclude them, if you have processes which exclude them, if you have managers that don't have the ability to manage people properly and so exclude or make people feel as though they don't belong? It's a cruel thing to put someone through because of the impact on their mental health, but it doesn't make any business sense. Inclusion makes business sense. So that's what I say to people who talk about this just being political correctness and that, you know, we'll stop talking about it soon enough. I know I won't stop talking about it.
I know you won't, Heeral. Thank you. And you've touched on a key word there, it's that discomfort, our resistance to change. We've all seen the complaints to Ofcom about the diversity performance last weekend. So there is this absolute discomfort, and the only way that some people know how to deal with that discomfort is to resist. And that leads me to my next question. For those of us who are working in the inclusion space, there's a word that many of you will have heard over the last couple of years: intersectionality. My question, and it is a bit of a controversial question to the panel. So Caroline, I'm going to ask this question to you, but Heeral, Nancy, feel free to jump in. Are we making things more complicated for ourselves by demanding an intersectional approach? Are we making it more difficult to counter the resistance by asking for an intersectional approach?
My clear answer to that, Suki, is a definite no. Because when we talk about intersectionality, we're talking about the whole individual and what it means to be a person who has different elements of who they are and how they interact with people. And when we're not looking at intersectionality, we're missing out on a very key part of a person's identity. And we're often talking about and hearing this phrase, bring your whole self to work. And I listen to that and it sounds as if, what exactly does that mean, bring your whole self to work? Often people say, you need to be your authentic self. You can talk about your mental health. We need to get rid of the stigma. You can talk about your sexuality. We shouldn't be shy about talking about people's disabilities. That's not what really being your whole self to work is really. It's about understanding the different facets of who we are and how they interconnect. So I'm a Black heterosexual, able-bodied, agnostic, and that's very different to being a white middle-aged Jewish man. So to treat me the same as you would a white middle-aged Jewish man is doing a great disservice, because we experience the world in a very different way. We have different perspectives, we have different things to bring, and we have different challenges as well. So when we talk about intersectionality and we really want to understand and really identify with people and to have that full engagement, because that engagement is really important, then it's about looking at intersectionality. And that, I think, doesn't on the one hand, people can see it as complicated because there's more work to do. It involves actually taking more time, understanding, and it's more complicated. But in fact, for me, it makes it a lot more sense in order for us to really connect with people, for us to open up our cultures and our work environments to really bring people into the workspace. And that's what inclusion means for me. So that's what I would say about intersectionality.
Thank you, Caroline. And Nancy, from your from your role, when you're looking at measuring, does intersectionality create a problem for you? Does it create a challenge?
It makes the analysis more complicated. There's no denying that just from a purely statistical point of view. But I would agree. I mean, I think there's what Caroline says is absolutely borne out by the data. So if I go into an organization to look at their gender pay gap, the gender pay gap will not be the same for Black women as it is for white women in that organization. And again, if that organization has data about sexuality, about socioeconomic background, about disability, all of those things play in. You can't just look at one of these aspects. Of course, you need to start somewhere, and the gender pay legislation was great around opening up some of these conversations that some of us have been trying to have for a long time, to say we need to acknowledge these biases. But what I see in my work with organizations is these things are not in competition. What you're doing is creating an environment where you're talking about these challenges and opening up the culture for people to be confident to say, here's my experience and here's how this affects me. So when you open those doors and you start talking about inclusion, you start creating that psychological safety for people in the organization, whether that's talking about the impacts on women of a particular situation, or it's talking about Black Lives Matter and the impacts on people in your organization from a racial perspective, that doesn't mean the other things don't matter. This is all about creating a culture of inclusion and creating a culture where we're able to have those hard conversations that we've been talking about and raise those difficult issues. So, we can't get to the root of the problem if we fail to acknowledge the intersectionality of these issues. The simple fact is, I'm less likely to die of COVID than Caroline because she's Black. And that's, we may be the same in every other way. We may have lots of similarities. I don't know, we might or we might not. But we can't ignore you know, that all of these things come into play. So the more that we can do to understand that, and the more that we can do to see how those different parts move, you know, from a statistical perspective, it's about the variables, and it's how those different variables affect outcomes for people. So yes, you know, Caroline's experience of COVID, were she to have it, would be impacted by her gender, but also by her sexuality, also by where she lives in her local hospital, and all of the things that unpacks about injustice in our societies. So we've got, you know, we're doing a disservice if we're not understanding the complexity of that.
Thank you. And a lot of the analytics that you're doing is measuring what currently exists, the current status quo in an organisation. If we were trying to improve inclusion practices at work, one of the initiatives that obviously has come across from the US, when we talk about things like affirmative action, we talk about quotas. In your experience, when you're measuring, you're crunching the numbers, do quotas have a positive or negative? Do they have an impact?
Yes, they usually have a positive impact. And I know that people find the concept of quotas really uncomfortable. But the simple fact is, if exposing people to the problem and relying on their common humanity to solve it were enough, we wouldn't be having this conversation now. These problems would have gone away. So nobody wants quotas. Nobody wants to feel they're the diversity hire, or they're the box ticking candidate, or they've been given a board role because of some quota. But the reality is we have unspoken quotas in every organisation at the moment anyway. I mean, you only have to look at who runs FTSE 100 companies in the UK. The quote, you know, there's in effect a quota that you need to be a white man, probably called Stephen or David, in order to get that role. So we have to stop thinking of quotas as a way to kind of bump up people who may not deserve to be there, and think of it instead as clearing out some of the people who've got to positions of power without necessarily, you know, the right qualifications in terms of their skills and leadership experience, but they've got there because of their background. So, you know, if we think that we live in a country where there are no quotas, they may not be written, they may not be spoken, but they're definitely there. And all of the research tells us that if you put targets around these things, you will see changes in behaviour. If you ask people to change their behaviour, it takes a long time and it may never happen. So, you know, I know people get very, quotas are bad. I would just say use them intelligently. Think about the behaviour that you're trying to change, and ask yourself, are you prepared to wait 20, 30, 40 years for everyone in your organisation to come around to your way of thinking, or do you want to make a difference now? Because if you want to make a difference now, quotas are a way to do it.
No, thank you. And that's really echoes my feelings on this matter, that it's two issues. It's about how we use language, so that automatic resistance, like you've said, the moment I say quotas, there's a resistance, as opposed to it already informally exists. It's just skewered one way. And then about the numbers. If we can't measure it, how will we know that we're making a difference? And again, this resistance that we have to putting those measures in place. And coming on to language, a question for Caroline or for Heeral, and I'm not picking on the two of you as the women of colour on the panel, but we use certain terms. We use BAME, B-A-M-E. Do these terms help or hinder change?
I would have to say, Suki, that definitely hinder. I very much feel that the term BAME tends to label and categorize and gives the message there's no difference, they're all the same. And this then doesn't foster openness. Then you're putting people in a group and you're sidelining them, and that creates division. And what we're wanting to do is bring people together. We want people to be able to develop an empathy and understanding of the different aspects of people's diversity. And when we're looking at inclusion, we really want to be able to look at people as individuals. And that ties into the intersectionality as well. So when you're using the term BAME, I think it actually is doing a great disservice. It's a term that is used to make things simpler, so that you don't have to then talk about the different aspects of these many groups and their interests. And I think that we really need to be moving away from that and looking at individuals and their backgrounds, their experiences, what they have to bring to communities, cultures, and workplaces. So that would be my take on that. I don't know, Heeral, your perspective.
So my perspective on the term is that if as an organization, as a person, if you're right at the beginning of your journey of understanding the differences in experiences and outcomes for when we're talking about ethnicity and race, if you're looking at the differences in outcomes for white people and then everybody else, to just understand and draw the distinction, that's probably the only time in which it's useful, where you're looking at the top level just to get a conversation going. But after that point, we do have to look at the nuances, because as we've said before, as Caroline said, that her experience as a Black woman is going to be very different to my experience as a British Indian woman. And the term BAME hides those differences. So once you're actually trying to understand people, then it's no longer useful. But I will say that when we're trying to bring people into the conversation in the very first instance, it's really the first step of the process. People need to understand the differences in outcomes. Just in the same way, when we talk about the outcomes for men in the workplace and women in the workplace, women, you know, we are very diverse within our gender group, but our outcomes as a group is still very different to the outcomes for men. So in that first instance, we do need to look at the overarching groupings. But then again, just as Nancy was saying with the the gender pay gap data, when you're looking at gender pay gap data, you can't just look at, okay, women overall earn whatever percentage less than men, because when you break that data down, the outcomes are different according to the women's race and women's sexuality. So that's what I would say about the term BAME.
Thank you, Heeral. And of course, historically, we needed to collectively agitate for change. So I absolutely get, from a numbers perspective, in the 70s, we all used the political term Black because we were fighting, racism. We were fighting the legislation, racism enshrined into legislation. But now I do absolutely agree that it starts doing us a disservice where we're still trying to lump everybody into one group. And when we talk about things like BAME or women's networks or any minority within the workplace trying to champion for change, this is a question for Caroline. Are HR negating their responsibilities? And then actually that's unfair. Are leadership teams negating their responsibilities when they outsource all of this responsibility, whether it's for inclusion, whether it's for diversity, whether it's for the disparity within the gender positions, when they're outsourcing these to the very people who are most disadvantaged by the current system?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question, Suki. And I would say it really depends on how it's being done, because you have a lot of diversity and inclusion specialists who are extremely committed and experienced and trained, and that's what they do. That is their focus. So when you approach a diversity and inclusion professional, they're very open to actually working with HR and with organisations to develop their diversity and inclusion strategies. If it's only left in the hands of the diversity inclusion specialist, and there's absolutely no responsibility within the organisation, then I think you will be looking at HR negating their responsibility. But I think if HR and the organisation are taking that seriously, and they hold on to the responsibility, and they're part of the process, they're part of the conversation, and that they're implementing that strategy, in a very meaningful, significant way, then that's more a partnership in diversity and inclusion. So I think as long as HR leaders are feeling and taking part in the whole process, and that they are understanding what that means, and they are establishing structures, ways of thinking, and developing their culture in line with diversity inclusion specialists, then it can be a great marriage.
Yeah. And I'm sure that everybody on this call has experienced, if not within their own workplace, but they've heard stories that in the wake of Black Lives Matter, suddenly they were reaching out to, Black or people of colour within their workforce to go, tell us what to do. Yeah, and it's just no, that isn't how it works. Of course you want to have those conversations, but you can't give the individuals at the receiving end of that inequity the responsibility to change it. And I think that's also a reflection of different corporate cultures. So Heeral, a question for you. In your experience, what differentiates a good corporate culture from a bad corporate culture when it comes to being truly inclusive?
I always say that if you really want to know how people feel about their place of work, and of course this is pre-COVID days, but if you really want to know how people feel about where they work, listen to the conversations that happen in corridors, not in meetings, in corridors. I think a good corporate culture is one where people will talk about where they work when they're not at work, and say good things. But most of the time, you know that it's a bad corporate culture because we always talk about things that we're not happy with, and those people will be loud and proud, whether that's in the office or whether they are in their own private, personal friend groups, family groups, whatever it might be. So do people feel like they can share their ideas easily? Do you allow people to share their ideas? Is there a sense of psychological safety? Even as an HR leader, do you yourself feel able to raise points that might be a little bit difficult to talk about with your CEO? Is it a psychologically safe culture? If you don't have psychological safety, it's not inclusive. So that's what I would say. Everyone, every single member of the senior leadership team needs to ask themselves that question. Is this a psychologically safe culture? Do I trust that I will get an honest, a candid answer from the people that work for me when I ask them about their experience of working here? And of course, there's having conversations, but it's simple. Find out, run a survey, run an anonymous diversity and satisfaction survey, because then you'll find out whether or not there are certain groups that are having a worse experience than others. I ran a survey last year for a company, and interestingly, and it's a pretty inclusive company. There were no, about 50 people. They're a pretty inclusive company. However, when I saw the survey results, all the white straight men said it's the best place, most inclusive place they ever worked. And anyone who wasn't white, straight, or a man, whatever their other intersections might be, had comments on what could be improved. So I think that tells you a lot. There are differing experiences, and you're not going to find that out by just thinking about it. You need data. It's a business decision, right? Businesses don't make any other decisions without data. Why are they making inclusion and diversity decisions based on a wing and a prayer? I don't understand. So anyway,
Heeral.
Sorry, that's me going off on one again.
I absolutely love that. Can anyone else hear a beeping sound? I don't know whether it's in my street or on...
It was my street.
Oh, okay.
Go on mute now. Sorry.
So Heeral, absolutely, I love that. I absolutely agree. We would not approach any other business decision. We wouldn't even buy new chairs without going, you know, what's the business case for this? Who's going to be on the team?
Exactly.
What do these chairs give us? So Nancy, what data can we use to drive this change? What does make a difference?
I mean, from my perspective, I mean, hurrah for data. Let's just get that out there.
Yeah.
Like, let's please look at this, as Heeral says, as a business problem in the same way that we would look at costs and sales revenue and overhead expenses and all of those things. That this is a problem that, you know, we should tackle in the same way. We should afford it the same level of kind of careful thought that we do all those other things. And yes, we should set targets around it, and you know, the same way that you set a sales target for your sales team, you should be setting targets around how you want to see the change happen, because that will make people accountable. But you know, one of the things I hear a lot from organizations is we don't have any data. Firstly, not true. Every company has loads of data. It may not be perfect, it may not give you everything that you want from day one, but you've got data and you've got enough to make a starting point. You know, if you simply know the number of employees you have and how much to pay them, that's data in itself. But the other thing I would say is, don't ignore unstructured data. So don't ignore, as Heeral was saying, what people say and the kind of data that you can get from listening to people or doing surveys. So all of that kind of conversation is a form of data. It's not numbers in a spreadsheet, but it's a form of data. And you know, one of the things that technology enables us to do is understand that data at scale. So when we think about natural language processing, which is one of the ways that we understand that data, what we know is, in common business English, how often certain terms you would expect to come up. What's the frequency with which people talk about certain terms? And you can do this analysis, you know, against any kind of term or part of speech that you like. But what we can now do is we can look at that survey data much more quantitatively and say, in this organization, this concept is overrepresented. People talk about this concept more than we would expect them to hear. Because one of the problems with surveys is, you know, if you've had a bad day, or I don't know, something's going on at home, you might tend to be more negative than you might if you took it the next day. But what this allows us to do is clear out that noise and say, actually, this concept comes up a lot in this organization. So we think there's something there that's untypical, that needs some attention, and that we can pick out as being significant. And that's, I think, where you really get into those interesting conversations around what's really going on in the organization versus maybe what leadership think or hope is going on in the organization. So, you know, the data is, the first step in any of this is to shine a light on the data and say, where are we right now? And that takes courage. We've talked about the fact that some people don't want to do that, and the simple fact is they don't want to do it because we know that it's not going to look great. You know, we knew with the gender pay gap that organizations were going to be exposed for systematically underpaying women, and that's proved to be the case. We know the same is true if we start to look at pay data from an ethnicity perspective. You know, we sort of know what it's going to tell us, and that's why people don't want to do it. And I understand that, but we have to, you know, we have to be brave enough to eyeball that, and shine those lights into the dark corners of our organization. And the reason that data is really powerful is because it enables us to have that conversation in a different way. So we've talked, you know, the other panelists and you, Suki, you've talked about having those difficult conversations and being brave enough to have that. And the data can provide a way to have that maybe moves beyond some of that emotion, which is very real. And I'm not saying we should ignore that emotion that attaches to these issues. But if we can talk about, okay, as an organization, systemically, this is what we can see in our data. We're moving away from accusing individuals and moving into organizationally, we all have a responsibility to look at this and to understand it and to see how we can make changes around it. So that's one of the ways that data, I think, is really powerful in this area.
And I absolutely agree. Data gives us a degree of separation. It makes it about the issue and not about us as individuals. So I'm conscious of time. I could continue this conversation all morning and beyond, but I am conscious that we'd scheduled this for 45 minutes. One thing before I open it up to wider chat for anybody else that would like to stay on the call for the full hour, is I would like to ask each of the panelists, if there was only one thing you could ask everybody else on the call to do from today, what would that one thing be? Heeral, would you like to?
Yes, I would ask everyone to introspect and think about what stops you from having those difficult but brave and courageous conversations, because it's only when we start having those that we'll see true change occur.
Thank you. Nancy?
I think, yeah, one thing, it's so hard. I guess to continue my theme, just to be brave enough to start looking at the data and acknowledge that it's not perfect and you may not have everything, but start that process now, because the longer you delay in starting to collect data, the harder it's going to be. And the sooner you start, the closer you are to getting meaningful insights out of it. So, you know, start doing that work now. With, you know, don't wait to be asked, don't wait for legislation, don't wait for somebody to challenge you on it, and be brave enough to share the bad news as well as the good news.
No, thank you, Nancy. Thank you. Caroline?
For me, Suki, it goes back to people asking themselves what it really means when you say bring your whole self to work. And when you're engaging with that, looking at the mental health aspects, the intersectionality, what it is for you as a HR leader to be engaging with all of those different aspects of people's life experience, and how can you gain that kind of support and insight that you feel that you can really develop a culture that is truly diverse and inclusive.
Thank you, Caroline. Thank you to all three of you. We do have a couple of questions that have come in, and I do ask everyone on the call, feel free to come off mute, turn your video on to ask a question. Marina's asked a great one in the chat, so I'll let her ask it in person.
Great, thank you, Suki.
Hey, Marina.
Super session. Thank you for taking the time and sharing your experience and expertise. Amazing. Nancy, at the beginning you mentioned something that really just hit me in the face around language and how it shapes culture and how we can inadvertently be actually having a negative impact. What does that look like? How does that manifest? Can you unpack that a little bit, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, my interest has always really been about how as a society we create language that serves our needs, whatever those needs might be. So, you know, there are obvious examples that we probably all recognize. So do we talk about women as being bossy and men as being determined or assertive? So at that kind of level, there's probably things that we're all familiar with. But everybody responds to language in quite a personal way. The sort of contexts around it can be quite personal. But that said, they can also be grouped. So we know that women are less likely to apply for roles if they're presented using certain types of language. We know that talking about sort of dynamism can be off-putting for women, for example. We also know that there's some quite interesting research on socioeconomic background that suggests that to talk about skills in terms of kind of innate personality sort of traits can be off-putting from people from different lower socioeconomic backgrounds. So we might say, you must be creative. And that can be quite off-putting because it kind of casts it as a sort of innate trait. Whereas if you say you must have the ability to think creatively, that's then a skill that someone can demonstrate to you and talk about how they can develop that. So it's, you know, these are small and subtle tweaks that we can make. But what I see, to give you a concrete example of what I was talking about, what I see often is a company will have a diversity statement on their website somewhere. Often it's on the jobs page or the careers page, whereas obviously I would advocate it should be front and center of everything. But they will have a diversity statement that talks about how they value people and how everyone has equal opportunity to succeed in this organization. And then you look at their kind of mission statement or something, and its implications are very, very different. So Goldman Sachs is an example that I often quote, where they talk in their careers page about how they value all their employees and everybody's contribution, and everybody can succeed here. In their mission statement, they talk about, essentially the customer is king. We will do anything to make sure our customers are happy with what we do. And it goes into a lot more detail that, but the obvious implication is we expect our employees to give over their life to this company. So we expect them to work long hours when the client needs them to. We expect them to not be going home to pick up their kids from school because they're sick if the client doesn't want them to do that. So these disconnects are very subtle, but they're signaled all the time in the way that companies talk about themselves. And you need to be really, really clear about what it is that you're trying to say. And as I say, not just simply saying, we really care about diversity, but actually what we really want is for you all to be like this. And because we're very good at humans as picking up those nuances, we're very good at decoding language. It's an innate sort of human trait, if you like. So it needs to be really carefully thought through.
And it's always reflected in images as well. That, like you say, the diversity statement can be right next to a picture of the leadership team or the board. And the contrast is there for everybody to see.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you, Nancy.
Thank you, Marina, for a great question. Anybody else? We've had lots of comments to the panel. Thank you for a great session. Thank you for how insightful. Awesome. Yeah, practical insights, loved it. I think if there's no more questions, I will, of course, share the panelists' details. Please please do reach out to them on LinkedIn or via email. Continue the conversation with them, continue the conversation with your workplaces. Thank you so much to the panelists, for each of you sharing your time, your expertise as always, but for all of you for joining, for you to have carved out this hour when I know how much you are all juggling, to have this conversation, to actually sit with the discomfort, but also I hope to get some nuggets of inspiration for the days, weeks, months and years ahead. So thank you all.
Thank you, Suki. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Suki.
You are so welcome. Thank you. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Have a good day. Bye.
Bye.